that's why I thought it more advisable to concentrate on a few of them, especially the ones following the First World War from the interwar period, and make a few generalizations and treat them as a sort of object of case study. It's very interesting that there are relatively few works, even historical works, from the interwar period which look into the deeper causes of the First World War, dealing with a more general context, a well-taught history context. Memoirs, as well as early analysis of the origin of the First World War, mainly concentrate on the internal issues, internal conflicts, and internal problems of the monarchy. Also, very often, these memoirs show the outbreak of the war as a sort of accident of history, which the Germans very often use, Betriebsunfall, for the Second World War, namely. So the three most important questions that Hungarians concentrated on after the First World War in the 1920s and 30s were the following: how we actually slipped into the war in 1914. Once we were in, was there a way out? This was typically answered by no. There was no real choice but to hold out until the end. And third, probably the most important question for all Hungarians, even today, how the First War ended, how we came out of the First World War, and why we came out of it so badly. So today in politics, this is the most striking point of debate, and again, this results in less research concerning the outer world and the general context, more looking inside and finding people responsible. And just recently, more debate was coming out over the one of the most important personalities of the time, István Tisza and his monument. Just look outside and you see as it was restored just recently after more than 40 years, more than 60 years, sorry. So we are somehow, in our views of the First World War, pinned down, stuck at 1918, 1919, and even the Second World War is somewhat viewed from that perspective. Now, the first historian I'd like to mention was one of the most acknowledged and widely known historians of the period, Hendrik Marcali, and he wrote an essay which I found not exactly a historian's work, but rather a pamphlet, How the Great War Was Made. And it was dedicated to Tisza. And just one short remark he made, which, so I tried, in all of the memoirs, I tried to find those parts which were somehow striking, strange, or unusual. And he wrote, the real declaration of war was in fact regicide in Serbia in 1903. So, which many thought was the real beginning of the war, the real beginning of hostilities between Serbia and the monarchy. Otherwise, most of the memoirs, and so is Marcali's pamphlet, are mainly a bit overwritten with sometimes in the style of the 18th century or in the 19th century, and they are all emotional. So even in the case of such an important and well-known historian with authority, one doesn't really see the historian in the lines written. Now, perhaps one of the most well-known memoirs is that of Count István, who wrote obviously in a very apologetic manner concerning Tisza. However, he even pointed out some of the failures of Tisza and tried to be critical. It's rare to find in the memoir. I just quoted one sentence. So he criticized that Tisza could not follow the times, and at the same time the leaders of neighboring states could do that, the general trend. So Tisza in a way was not trendy enough. Also, as I mentioned, there were a number of internal policy narratives which were characterized by parliamentary obstruction and a general atmosphere of crisis, and the interest was very much limited to Hungary and the monarchy and the crisis of the dual empire, and less attention was given to the outer world and the power relations or the global aspects of the conflict, of the looming conflict. After the war, perhaps I can mention 2 or 3 memoirs, and especially the one of András Joó the Younger, which provide and tried to do it, their intention to provide a deeper insight into the international conflict. However, even, but not surprisingly, András's memoir, or I wouldn't call it a memoir, rather an analysis, is very apologetic towards his father. However, he tries to point out the failures of the long-term annexation project of Bosnia and Herzegovina. So this is just an illustration to show that his work, diplomacy and World War, shows a clear intention of self-reflection, and it really goes beyond traditional views and the general views which appear in the memoirs during the 1920s. So he also pulls in an aspect of modernity, which is illustrated by these 2 pictures, his photo and a cubist variant of his portrait. Now, what were his main observations? Which were the interesting or striking or unusual observations? He said, for example, that peace lasted too long. If war had come earlier, the disaster wouldn't have been so great. And another central focal point of his reasoning is that drawing Italy into the Triple Alliance was probably the turning point, and if we look back in history, that was probably the worst move. It's a bit overemphasized as well. Now, another important aspect which he concentrates on is the Anglo-German antagonism and its role. However, even András, while trying to be neutral, shows a lot of cliches, like the encirclement cliche of the German historiography and history writing. However, from the point of view of geopolitics, it's probably the best essay I read. Also, one of the other cliches is the role of King Edward VII of England. However, other memoirs like that of Burian point out that the role of Edward VII as King of England was rather moderate, and had he lived longer, the war wouldn't have broken out. So these cliches actually, which appear even before 1914 in the diplomatic correspondence of the time, in the texts of Ehrenthal, Szőcs, who was the ambassador in Berlin, they keep on going in the memoirs. It's very clearly, it's easy to observe that. Okay, another diplomat, former diplomat, very important one indeed, Hungarian aristocrat, Count Aleksandar. He was the chef de cabinet of Bertolt. He wrote a complete book on the role of the Anglo-German antagonism and the Balkan policy of Austria-Hungary. This work is again fairly objective in spite of his direct role in the crisis. He was actually one of the scapegoats after the war, and even now his person is somewhat in the center of attention, especially some of the recent research in Austria. They discovered a number of new facts on his role in the July crisis of 1914. Now the next problem, heavily discussed in the memoirs, is the viability of the dual monarchy, whether it could survive even though the war was lost, and the possible role of Franz Ferdinand, had he lived longer, had he become king. And I picked another interesting quote from the memoir of Otto Kaczernin, Im Weltkriege. According to him, it was good luck, although he belonged to the circle, although the wider circle of Franz Ferdinand. He said it was rather lucky to lose him before the war started, as the whole structure of the monarchy was so much in decline that he couldn't have done anything. Well, if we consider his plans for Hungary and the renewal of the monarchy, I should agree with that. Also, the general determinism and pessimism, which was already present before the war, continues in the memoirs, in most of the Hungarian memoirs as well. And probably most of you know the name of Salomon Bank, who unfortunately died this year, and he did so much for showing the attitudes of the ruling elite in the monarchy just on the eve of the First World War, and how pessimistic it was. So it's again a quotation from Czernin's work. And I try to speed it up, but perhaps it's advisable. Okay, in general, it's not frequent at all that the memoirs could form a proper link between the need for internal reform and the efforts and the international situation. So there's a kind of missing link between the so-called raison d'etre of the monarchy and the European framework, least of all a global framework. However, sometimes Burian even and some of the very few memoirs, I should mention that, which draw a favorable picture of Franz Ferdinand. The problem was, the central problem was how to create an Austro-Hungarian or a sort of patriotism of the empire, Heimat des Herzens. Okay, one of the really unique memoirs is József Kristófi's interpretation, who is a member of a former government which has a reputation in Hungarian history, the Fehérvári government. And who was an admirer and supporter of Franz Ferdinand, a really unique person in the Hungarian elite, I should point out. Also, his memoirs are very much characterized by determinism and a very low view of anybody who came after Franz Ferdinand, mainly Tisza and then Károly. And he was also an ardent supporter of voting rights and the extension of voting rights, secret and general ballot. So is his portrait, the Golgotha of Hungary. We love to choose that sort of titles. And there's another interesting analysis of a historian of law, Bruckner Győző, who provides a very detailed analysis of the relationship of Tisza and Franz Ferdinand. It's more a historical essay and a very good one, I think, as he had the chance to do some archival research by then. Okay. The next question is the war guilt. Obviously, it was very important for Hungary, and we, as the country, tried to take part in a cooperation initiated by Germany, and perhaps it's quite well known that a conference was organized in 1926 in Berlin, which started this process and started a coordinated effort in the propaganda of Germany, Austria, Hungary, and Bulgaria. Also, it was organized to avoid mutual blaming. So it was also very frequent to put the blame on either Austria or Germany within the circle of the defeated. And Jenő Horváth is perhaps the only historian of the interwar period who, again, did detailed research in foreign archives and who was more interested in the general international context. No wonder he was the one in charge to take part in these discussions. Actually, finally they approached the Carnegie Endowment for support, and the long-term plan was to create a full international cooperation to discover the origins of the World War. The next point, very often touched upon, is the failure of leadership, as it is very clearly expressed in some sentences of István Burian regarding his personal role as the common foreign minister of the monarchy. So a very unique role in the history of state and law, even. Okay, and finally, on the causes of war, Peter Ágoston's work, which is rather, again, a pamphlet, I found it interesting because he was part of an active government position during the Soviet Republic, and then he became foreign minister, and he was involved in the negotiations of the Soviet Republic with the Entente powers, and he won considerable authority and respect with the Entente powers. However, this pamphlet of his, a retrospective pamphlet written in 1919, brought up a very similar reasoning to Christoph, who was a conservative and supporter of Franz Ferdinand, and which I found unique was that he brought up the idea of collective responsibility. So what he thought was clearly that the governed also carry a certain amount of responsibility, and it's not without reason to punish the governed, so the ones who are without any concrete responsibility. And actually I found it really strange, but that these are his words. Okay, so what among the closing remarks, just to cut it short, what is beyond the empire? That was the central focus of memory writers, or memoir writers, and the legacy of the First World War lived long after the end of the war, and I haven't done so much research recently, unfortunately, in that period, so I had to refresh my memory a little bit. But I did more research on the Second World War, and while I was analyzing foreign policy during the Second World War, again and again I faced the tangible legacy of the war, even concerning the decision-making process, and a certain nostalgia, especially concerning the periods of time before the First World War and the lessons of the end of the First World War. And that was the central interest, and that remained the central interest even during the Second World War. How the First War ended, and how can we avoid a similar end, a repetition of the end of the First World War, which was chaotic, the ruling classes lost control, and how we can return back to the old times. And I did more research in the Second World War government of Kállai Miklós, and as he wrote a letter advising the Hungarian representative in Switzerland what to do with the amount of money that was in a Swiss bank for the case of the government abroad if German occupation happens. He pointed out that only an emigre government can use the fund, or if not, it can go to the hands of Otto Habsburg, which clearly shows that the second option and a still viable option seem to be a big step towards restoration if the end of the war makes it possible. Also, I wanted to say a couple of things about the July crisis, but I think my time is up. Okay, so I'm happy to answer your questions, and I hope it was interesting.